My name is Emily, and my story was anything but easy. Since I was little, I was raised by my Aunt Linda. My mother passed away when I was still a baby, and my father, well, he never wanted to know about me. My aunt, my mother's sister, took custody of me, but not out of love or compassion. She saw me as a free maid, someone she could exploit without guilt. She was always selfish and fake. To others, she pretended to be a generous woman who lovingly took care of her orphaned niece. But inside our home, the reality was different. I woke up early, prepared breakfast, washed the clothes, cleaned the house, and still had to listen to complaints. Nothing I did was ever enough. If a glass wasn't sparkling clean, she would yell. If I took too long to finish something, she called me lazy. Things got worse when my aunt started working as a housekeeper at Mrs. Margaret's home, a rich and busy woman. But in reality, I was the one doing all the work. My aunt took me along, and as soon as we walked through the door, she would sit on the couch, turn on the TV, or scroll through her phone while I scrubbed the floors, washed the dishes, and ironed clothes. I remember the first day. I arrived at that huge house, looked around, and thought that maybe my aunt was taking me to a safe place. But I soon realized the truth. As soon as Mrs. Margaret left for work, my aunt handed me a long list of chores and went to rest in the guest room. I swept and mopped the entire house while my aunt ate the expensive snacks from the pantry. Many times, she made me clean the bathrooms while she lay down listening to music. When I finished, she would inspect every corner, and if she found even a speck of dust, she made me redo everything. The dishes were another problem. Mrs. Margaret loved to cook, so the sink was always full of dirty pots and plates. I spent hours scrubbing, my small hands already cracked from the cleaning products, while my aunt chatted loudly with her friends on the phone. Some days, the house needed a deep cleaning. My aunt made me move heavy furniture, clean huge carpets, and even dust the chandeliers while standing on an unstable chair. Once, I almost fell, but my aunt didn't even care. She just told me to stop being clumsy and keep going. What hurt me the most was that whenever Mrs. Margaret was around, my aunt pretended to be exhausted, as if she had spent the whole day working hard. I wanted to tell the truth, but I was afraid. My aunt gave me threatening looks, and I knew that if I spoke up, my life would become even worse. Over time, Mrs. Margaret started noticing strange things. My hands were always red and dry, my clothes were old and stained, and I always looked exhausted. She would ask if I was okay, but my aunt would quickly answer for me, making up excuses. One day, my aunt made me clean the entire yard, raking up dry leaves, collecting trash, and even pulling out weeds with my bare hands. Meanwhile, she lay on a lounge chair, drinking lemonade. The problem was that Mrs. Margaret came home early from work and saw everything. She didn't say anything at that moment. She just observed. But the next day, she installed cameras in the house without telling my aunt. Within a few days, she had all the proof: me working non-stop, my aunt resting, me washing windows while my aunt laughed, watching TV. That's when everything changed. One morning, Mrs. Margaret asked my aunt to go to her office. I stayed in the kitchen, nervous. Minutes later, I heard shouting. My aunt was trying to justify herself, making excuses, but the footage spoke for itself. Mrs. Margaret didn't waste any time. She fired my aunt on the spot. My aunt stormed out, dragging me by the arm. But before we could leave the house, Mrs. Margaret called me. "Emily, can I talk to you?" My aunt tried to answer, but Mrs. Margaret ignored her. She looked into my eyes and asked, in the sweetest voice I had ever heard, "Do you want to stay here with me?" My heart raced. I didn't know what to say. My entire life, I had only known hard work and humiliation. But for the first time, someone was giving me a choice. I looked at my aunt, who seemed ready to explode with rage. Then I looked at Mrs. Margaret, who was looking at me with kindness and concern. I took a deep breath and made the decision that would change my life. Yes, I want to stay. My aunt screamed, insulted me, and said I was ungrateful. But Mrs. Margaret stood firm. She told my aunt that if she didn't leave willingly, she would call the police. And so, for the first time, my aunt had to leave without getting what she wanted. From that day on, my life changed. Mrs. Margaret didn't treat me like a maid, she treated me like a daughter. She enrolled me in school, bought me new clothes, and most importantly, gave me love and security. It took me a while to adjust. I still woke up early out of habit, ready to work, but she would send me back to bed. I had nightmares about my aunt coming back to take me away, but Mrs. Margaret always reassured me. Time passed, and I finally understood what it meant to be truly loved. My Aunt Linda became a part of my past, and I moved forward with a new family, a new life, and finally, a future to dream about. And you, what would you do in my place? Would you forgive and give a second chance, or would you do as I did and move on? Tell me in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories, leave a like to help the video reach more people, and most importantly, share it with your friends. It makes all the difference. See you next time.